Hey guys, welcome back to Houdini Houdono, the simulation edition. This is a 10-part mini tutorial series, and the objective is to quickly and effectively introduce the simulation tools in Houdini and how to easily control and direct the simulation, right? So it's targeted for beginners, but not absolute beginners. So if you don't know how to get around Houdini, I recommend that you go check out Houdini Isn't Scary on YouTube. Otherwise, let's jump into this tutorial. What you see on the screen now is the effect that we're going to achieve. It's basically a cloth draped over a human, right? And then you can use this for Halloween. It's a bit early in the year for this, but I think it's a pretty neat effect. Okay, so let me give you a quick intro to this setup. You can see this is the demo file that I've already prepared. Here, let's have a look at this. It's basically one of Houdini's motion capture data. And so this guy's walking. I had a grid, and then I put it at the top of his head over here, and then I configured some simulation properties of it as a cloth and ran the simulation using a Vellum solver, and that's about it. It is really the basics of a Vellum simulation, but I think I will try to explain a little bit more on how to control certain aspects of the Vellum tools. Okay, so let's start with a new file. So let's drop down motion capture data. I used mocap biped 2. You can see here this guy's just walking. Change my simulation time frame to 100 frames and check the real-time toggle. So with that, I will actually want this walk fast motion because there's a little bit more energy in this. I'm gonna hide it and drop down a geo node, call it setup, and also turn off the display. Jump into it and drop down an object merge to then point to the mocap data's deform node. So just scroll down all the way until you find the deformation node, which is over here under geo and geo1 underscore deform. So having brought that in, we can now place a cloth at the top of his head. To do that, drop down a grid, and I'm going to use this match size tool. This node allows me to plug in a secondary input and then just choose justify y as the maximum, and it will be at the top of his head. The only problem is on every frame the top of his head is different, so I'm just gonna drop down a time shift. This allows us to freeze frame the mocap data, so I will just ensure that it's on frame 1, and then I'm just gonna drop down a transform node to raise it up a little bit, 0.1, and say rotate it by 45 degrees for my cloth to then drip onto the guy. Let me template the guy now, and let's have a look. The cloth is a little bit big, so I'm just gonna size it down to 2 by 2 meters, and this should be enough. To get a little bit more resolution, I'm just gonna drop down a subdivide node after the grid. So I could technically increase the rows and columns over here, but I find this a little bit easier to control. I can just dial in 2 or 3 divisions like this. So that's basically the cloth, and I can now drop down a Vellum configure cloth. All you gotta do is to type the initials of the node that you want to place in Houdini. So in this case, I typed VCC, Vellum configure cloth, and we'll get this node. Next, we'll drop down a Vellum solver, and then I'll run a playback on this simulation here. It falls through the man and through the ground because on the Vellum solver, we can check this box over here, and it allows us to turn on the ground plane. And also under the visualize, I don't like to see the ground plane, so I'm going to turn off the guide geometry and the collisions. Next, I'm just going to pull my actual motion capture data over here as the collision geometry into the third stream so that it considers the motion capture data as the collision, right? So let's run the simulation again. Okay, so that's looking about right, with the exception that it's very low res. You can see it's jaggy like this. Even if you were to subdivide it after, it still looks like a low resolution simulation, you know. There are not a lot of creases and stuff like that. So the trick to getting more detail in your simulation data is to have more divisions on your source geometry. So there's no way around it. You need more divisions in order for the solver to then calculate all the creases. It needs more resolution to deform, right? There's no way to kind of like fake it such that it looks good, but of course it will then add to computation time. So for now, I'm just gonna leave it at 2. So let me demonstrate to you. So right now it solves quite fast and there is no weird stretching whatsoever over here at the top of the head. A little bit, but it's not too much. If I increase this to say 4 over here and just go to the first frame and run the simulation, you will notice that it's a lot slower and also there's a lot more detail, but you get some strange deformation like this. In order to solve the overstretching of this, one of the quickest ways is to increase the accuracy of your solve. Right. So let's go to the Vellum solver. Go to solver here and increase the substeps to say 5, and we will see what happens. It is very significantly slower now, but you can see that over here there's a lot less stretching. It's a much more accurate solve. Right, and with this amount of resolution, it allows us to get some detail over here. Let me bring this up a bit higher to say 6 divisions here, and then I'm just going to introduce some tiny bit of wind. So pop wind. Just give it an amplitude of 1 and the swirl size to 0.25 to see if I can gather a little bit more detail in the simulation. Okay, so the idea is that I will run most of the simulation at like a subdivision of 3. Once we like the general motion of it, that's where we can increase the resolution of the cloth to get a lot more extra detail. So right now 5 is really high, but I think it's the one that gives us a lot of detail. And I'm tempted to now lower my substeps a little bit and lower my constraint iterations a little bit, just to see if it still gives us decent results for a fraction of the time. You can see now that it simulates a little bit faster. And let's just show the wireframe to check the stretching. It is stretching, but I think it's quite a decent, acceptable amount of stretching. I don't think we can tell in the... Nope, I'm wrong, because here we have gathered a lot of nice folds over here due to the high resolution. But because of the lack of accuracy of the solve, everything is stretching way beyond what it's supposed to be. So I think that was a nice idea but a failed plan. Next, I want to bring your attention to the fact that the collision geometry is a little bit too coarse. So I think we would also need to subdivide this. So let me drop down the subdivide node. The whole Vellum system is a point-based dynamic system. And it assigns each point a p-scale to avoid collisions with itself, right? So if I were to drop down a sphere, just leave it as the default to 1 by 1, and I'll drop down a copy to points node, and just visualize each sphere. You realize that Vellum actually automatically sizes down the p-scale to something it thinks is decent. So this is automatic ever since 18.5. We can see that if we lower the subdivisions of our input source geometry to say 2, we can see that it automatically scales up the p-scale per point. Right? So this is clever on the side of the software, so we don't have to worry too much about this. But what we do have to worry about is that on the collision geometry, this is not the case. All the points are super huge, so we would like to copy the p-scale attribute from the Vellum configuration cloth. Right, so this is the node that actually automatically computed the p-scale and gave us the result like this over here. So we would like to drop down an attribute copy from this stream to this one over here, and instead of feeding it to the Vellum cloth, the configure node, we can feed this to the solver over here as the collision, and we can cancel this. Right. So the idea of this is to steal the p-scale from the configuration here, and we can preview once again the p-scale of this newly copied point. So prior to this, everything was crazy huge, and after it's much more reasonable. Right, and this will allow us to get a much better solve with the collisions. Right. So let's jump back to the solve over here. I'm just going to lower my divisions to 4 in the interest of time and change I think I cannot get away with substeps. With substeps of 3. Maybe I can keep my constraint iterations and the substeps 3. I'll try again. It's worth it. This looks promising, a lot less stretching. Alright, you can see now with this resolution we can get some nice folds over here. It may look like high resolution from here, but actually if we want to get some nice folds over here, we are unable to do that because there just isn't enough resolution, right? So we have no choice but to increase this to 6 or 5, right? In our final simulation. I'm just gonna down my resolution to 5. I think that's the most cost effective. And let's run this simulation. So having run the simulation for a little bit, I can tell that this will probably be the simulation settings that I will use, because it is still fairly okay to wait. I think I waited about a minute for like 30 plus frames, and you can see that there's some nice detail in the nose over here. But if we really want all the wrinkles between every fold, I recommend that we can go to this subdivide and just increase this to 6 and just be a little bit more patient and wait. Okay, so in order to cache this, drop down a file cache node, and the defaults are fine. I'll just, because the file name will be based on the node name, so I usually name my file cache node to something descriptive like cloth ghost, and I'll just press save to disk. I'm just gonna be a little bit more ambitious and change my subdivisions to 6, and fingers crossed, simulate. Save to disk in background, prompts me to save the file. I haven't saved the file, so I should save the file as version 2 demo. Save it and just save to disk in the background. Pressing save to disk in the background will run another instance of Houdini for it to then calculate the cache in the background, and we can continue using Houdini. So the prompt has opened. Don't ask me again, open the scheduler. So I can minimize this, and let's talk about something that I missed out. Yeah, this happens often, like you prepared your geometry and then you have done all your simulation, but you realize that you forgot to put the UVs, and then yeah, don't panic, because there's a way to get the UVs copied onto this geometry. Once as long as we have identical vertex count and the vertex positions, and basically the identical source geometry, we can unwrap over here. Give it a UV unwrap. Over here we can see that yes, proper UVs now, and we can actually then copy, attribute copy from my cache file. So I'm just going to drop down file node to bring in my cache. Just name this file node cloth ghost here, and I can't pick up my cache now because it's still caching the background. Like this is 16% done, but what I can do is to then copy, attribute copy. It will find all the matching points, and what we want to copy is the UVs, and we will be able to get the UVs from our source geometry. The good practice is to still have your UVs before you run your simulation, but it happens very often that we, once in a while forget and don't panic and rerun the whole simulation again. We can simply just steal the UVs from the source geometry and then just copy onto our simulation output. Right. So I'm just gonna anticipate that we'll be done with this in a few minutes. So let me just drop down out node and just call it cloth ghost. So while that is going, I think I can simulate one frame here to explain the thickness of the geometry. There is a very nice node in the vellum called vellum post process. Let's look at the vellum post process. There's some smoothing options over here, and there's some collision correction over here. In case you have smoothed it a little bit too much, you can detangle it, but we're going to ignore this too. And there's one over here called extrude by thickness, which is a very convenient checkbox that allows us to extrude this plane exactly by the P scale that we have defined in the simulation. And also what I love about this is that it actually extrudes upwards and downwards, like right from the center of the plane. It actually extrudes to give it thickness instead of from a certain direction like a poly extrude. So let me make a 1 by 1 grid to explain this. You can see in order to give this grid thickness, What we traditionally do is to drop down a poly extrude and just click over here and then extrude outwards like this. But this can be annoying because we actually want it to be in the center of where the source geometry is, and this can be troublesome to make using a few nodes in Houdini. As much as it's a vellum post process node, it doesn't mean that it has to be used with vellum, right? I can simply use the vellum post process node and turn on thickness like this, except that we don't see the thickness because we need to define the p-scale attribute. So let's just drop down a point wrangle to say that my p-scale is 0.1, or rather I'll give it a slider here, p-scale. And remember to press this UI button and we can define the p-scale like this, you see? It's super convenient if you would like to extrude something from the center of a plane, right? All you got to do is to define the p-scale and then drop down this node and check the checkbox, extrude by thickness versus this. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's have a check on the progress of the cache. It's 41% now. I think I can load it in, all 41 frames of it. You can see some very nice folds over here. And because of this amount of resolution, we can get some detail of the hands over here. Obviously, the resolution of your simulation also depends on from how far are you going to view this simulation, right? So if you're looking at a full body shot, this is more than enough detail, usually. Let's just prepare some texture, shall we? We can use the UV quick shade node, something like this, and the texture map we can point to a custom texture. So let's just make our ghost texture now by dropping down a copnet. Dive inside, drop down a color node, and just make sure that the color node is a, what size is it? Override size. Change it to a 2K texture like this. And then I'm going to just use a roto node. So I'm gonna make a black color. Color it black. And just multiply it on top of my white color and fit this roto in as a mask. Drop down a null node and type out ghost texture. So I managed to draw an alpha on the roto shape over here by changing add plane to A and just laying down a shape over here and then using it as a mask for the multiplication. So we can end up with a ghost texture over here. So in the next couple of minutes, I'm just figuring out how to use the COP network and trying to use the spline tool to draw the shape of the face, right? You could very well be using an existing texture that you have prepared in Photoshop or some paint program that you can draw the face in. So I'll fast forward this process. Okay, so this is my terrible face. I'm just going to copy this and let's just have a preview. Okay, so the cache is done. Let me just pick it up. Jump back to my scene view. Okay, so the cache is done and you can see that towards the end, while I get a lot of detail, nice detail over here, we didn't give the solver enough accuracy such that we are unable to solve this area properly, right? So I think we need to have a balance of this. So I'm just gonna lower my subdivisions to 5 instead and increase my, tried to get away with it but I couldn't, so I'm just gonna increase my substeps to 5 and just rerun the solve. Okay, so now that that cache is done, let me pick that up. It's a demo file over here and we should see that it all behaves well now. And we have copied our UVs over, and also in this cop2net here we have prepared this funny little face over here, which you can spend the time drawing or you can just draw it in Photoshop, right? It's just wanted to keep it as something that we all have access to, right? And then next is if I drop down the grid and drop down the UV unwrap and I apply a UV quick shade, if I just simply paste the directory of the texture over here of the node, you will realize it doesn't work. All you gotta do is to go to the front of it and type OP : and you should be able to bring up the texture like this. Right, and we can attempt to place the texture properly over here. By how should we do this? I think we can just click on the split the views like this, go to the composite view. And I believe we just gotta size it down and move it over. So dive inside, drop down a transform. Okay, so I've refined the shape of the texture over here, and this is just a preview. I don't actually want to use it. So this is the output geometry. Let's copy this node, jump outside and drop down a new geo node. Dive inside and drop down the object merge to bring in our simulated geometry like this. And from here, let's call this cloth ghost. And let's just do a very quick render setup. I won't go into detail like the previous tutorial. I think this entire series should be very much of a relevance to the simulation and how to control it, and also to keep it quite on the introductory level. So I don't want to bring in too much of Redshift shading. I plan to do another series to talk about using attributes for shading in Redshift. Nonetheless, I'm just going to show you how to set this up in Redshift fairly quickly. So here, just press Ctrl 1 for a quick mark to the object context. Go to the material context, press Ctrl 2, and go to the out context and press Ctrl 3. And on the material context, drop down the Redshift material builder. Just call this cloth ghost, and let's just drop it on here. Let's jump to the Redshift render view and kick off a render. I think before that, let's prepare the camera. So let's drop down a camera, call it render cam. Let's just look through the camera, select our cloth geo and focus on it. So it looks like this now. And we probably don't want to render all the initial frames like this, so perhaps something like frame 36 onwards. So let me change the frame range to 36 and jump over to the render view. So let's just ensure that on the Redshift node it picks up the render cam instead. Throw the extra camera away. Let's refresh the render. Let's drop down a light dome. So very quickly we have the cloth over here. Let's jump into the material here and drop down a Redshift texture. And to use the texture that we drew in the CopNet, I think we can just paste the directory. Let's try that. Go to the setup, jump to the CopNet, copy this node here, press 2, jump to the material context, jump into our material and paste this file name here. And let's just feed it into the diffuse color and let's refresh the render. We don't get to see the texture, so I think we failed. So let's try the same trick. Let's just put OP colon and see if that works. Yep, so we brought in our diffuse texture over here. Let's just very briefly discuss the cloth shader. I'm going to drop down an HDRI first. So just let's see. I'm just going to turn off the background and turn the saturation to none. And you can see that it doesn't really look like cloth because the way cloth interacts with the light is a little bit different. There's some light sheen happening at the edges of the cloth due to the fuzz on the cloth. And to mimic this, Redshift has, on the Redshift material, there is a very convenient slider here called the Shin. If I turn the reflection off and I turn up the Shin and turn down the diffuse, we can see that it is exactly this fuzziness of the cloth. This will then give us the effect that I was describing, the way the fuzziness of the cloth appears when it interacts with the light. Right. We can of course bring in a little bit of the usual reflection back. So the sheen is the reflection that I would usually use to describe cloth, but it is not to say that if there's more polyester into the fabric of the cloth, we can bring back the reflection also. So we can just do this to taste. It's not like, oh, it's cloth and we have to use the sheen, right? You can just do it to taste. Right. So the cloth is quite very much blurrer like this, and then I can bring back my diffuse weight like this. I do want to mention that on the Redshift node, jump to the IPR options here and turn on this live sub updates, live style sheet updates, and live Cop2 textures updates. Right? These are not turned on by default, and it probably doesn't allow you to then scrub the timeline and see the updates of your textures. We can use this as the diffuse texture, or we can actually use this information to drive the opacity, right? So let's plug it into the opacity color here. And I'm just going to not plug it into the diffuse color. And that's where we can see that we actually essentially cut a hole into this cloth like this. It kind of looks kind of scary now. Let me drop down a grid for the ground. And let me set this up in the viewport. As usual, another grid for the wall behind. This is the setup that I'm going to use for this entire series. Just make this 2 extra grids smaller. Like this, and I'm just going to stage it like that. And let's see what we have now in the render. Spooky. Gonna rotate my light a little bit. And perhaps drop down a redshift light. Okay, and I'll change my light to a point light. Just drop the intensity, change it to a red color. And just move the light upwards by 1 unit, 1.5 unit. 1.5 units is good. I just wanted to sit in the head of the character. And let's just change this light's color to this warm white. Warm white. And I think in this case I might just ditch the whole environment and increase my light samples over here under samples. Also the light samples of my dome light. So in order to mimic the thinness of the cloth, there's this other slider that we can use called backlit translucency. You can see if I increase it, it goes all wonky. Just maybe quite a low value like this. And quite a low value like this is good. I've decided to bring back the background and just call this BG. Assign the BG to all these objects here. So here is where I make some fine tuning on the lighting of the environment. The objective was to rotate my HDRI light such that I cast some nice angular shadows, and so that it sculpts the form of my cloth much nicer. And I also adjusted the light in the ghost to make sure that it's softer and it pronounces the hole that we cut into the cloth quite well. And this portion is just me adjusting these few parameters to achieve the look that I'm looking for. Well, you can see that the lighting setup that I just showed you is different from the demo at the start. This is because I thought it would be quite cool to have the light inside the ghost. I think it will be a lot more spooky that way. I hope it's okay that it's different and you guys can follow along. Okay, so let's do a quick recap on what we have so far. As an introductory to Vellum, this is a very simple setup, right? We got in a motion capture data like this. We then time shift it such that it's on the frame 1, and we prepared a grid. We subdivided the grid, and then we matched size to the top of this first frame over here, and then we just moved it a little bit higher and rotated 45 degrees for it to drape over the guy. Right. Then we ran a simulation we dropped down a Vellum configure cloth. We did not change any settings over here, we just left it as the default. And we dropped down a Vellum solver, to which we fed in the collision, and we turned on the ground plane. The only tricky thing we did here was to steal the p-scale value that is very nicely established over here automatically by the Vellum configure cloth, to get the very nice p-scale onto our collision object like this, so that we can get a nice solve. And after which we did our solve, we brought it in like this, and actually we are able to loop this animation if we are clever about it. So let's find out the frame at which we can attempt to loop this cloth simulation. It has to be after frame 36 because that's where the simulation has rested. And let's momentarily study our simulation cycle here. So say after frame 36, say there's a passing pose here of my right foot planted to the world center on frame 39, or rather right at this edge over here. Let's use 38. So we can use this as my start frame. Let's look at the cloth. It's okay as a start frame. Let's look at the human. And then it happens again somewhere here at frame 84. So 38 and 84 are very similar poses. So let's drop down 2 time shifts. Time shift 1, we're going to change the simulation output to plus 37 so that we hit 38 on the first frame, and 84, which I have to plus 83. And this one at frame 83, it's the one that I'm going to drop down a sequence blend to blend this into the start of the animation. Sequence blend. Let's have 2 inputs, and we'll blend from 1 to the second input like this, from 0 to 1. So let's keyframe on frame 1 at 0, and say 15 frames in, we'll move to the second clip. So essentially what we did is at this frame is identical to one of the frames that happened later in the timeline. I believe it's frame 47, right? So we can just render 46 frames and this thing will essentially loop forever. Let's test that idea out. Yep. And we can see that there are some intersections here. That's the limitation of the blending. Let's see if we can try to avoid it by adjusting the curves here. That's a linear blend. Yeah, perhaps something like this. And so with that, we can then feed it to the rest of the network. Just drag this down a little bit, put this in like this, and let's just continue with the recap. We've got the UVs over here from the main source. We forgot about the UVs before our simulation, and not to worry, we just created the UVs again and attribute copy the UVs onto our simulated geometry, and we drop down a UV quick shade, to which we prepared a comp network at the right side and picked up the texture over here. The thing to take note is to drop down this OP colon, and we can preview our texture here. However, we don't want to render that, so we'll just use that as a preview, just to be sure not to pipe it into the main out node, and drop down Vellum process to give it the thickness that we need. And then on the shading, we brought in some cloth texture over here and used it to drive a displacement on the cloth, and I used the OP texture over here to drive the opacity, which resulted in the ghost's mouth like this. We cut a hole, and just for the lighting setup, there is a HDRI with a couple of walls and a floor, and then I dropped a light in the center of the head over here to make it a little bit more spooky. Right, so that's it for the recap. I hope you have fun with this one, and it's a quick one, but I think it serves its purpose of introducing the basics of Vellum. So I'm going to annotate this file, and if you want to follow along the tutorial with the working file, please go to my Instagram. The handle is @Ronald_Fong, and then just DM me, and I will put the link somewhere or send you the file. Right? So thanks for your time, and I hope you learned something from this very quick and easy setup. I'll see you next Friday, Singapore time at 6 PM. and we'll be covering a little bit of the soft body stuff. Right, also using the Venom solver, so it's gonna be quite exciting. I'll see you there. Bye.